Sarah Martinez had always been particular about her morning coffee routine. Even after retiring from the Air Force 3 years ago, she maintained the same precise ritual that had kept her grounded during 22 years of service. The coffee beans were measured exactly, the water heated to the perfect temperature, and the pour was steady and controlled. It was one of the few constants in her civilian life that still made sense. The small cafe in downtown Portland had become her sanctuary. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, she would claim the corner table by the window, watching the city wake up while nursing her black coffee and reading the newspaper. The owner, Mrs. Chen, had grown fond of Sarah's quiet presence and often saved her favorite table without being asked. On this particular Thursday morning in October, Sarah arrived at the cafe earlier than usual. A restless night filled with familiar dreams had driven her from bed before dawn. Dreams of cockpit controls, radio chatter, and the vast emptiness of sky that had once been her domain. She ordered her usual black coffee and settled into her corner spot, grateful for the peaceful silence that only early morning could provide. The cafe was nearly empty except for a few early commuters grabbing their caffeine fix before rushing to catch buses or trains. Sarah appreciated the quiet atmosphere. After years of constant noise, orders being shouted, and the perpetual hum of aircraft engines, silence had become precious to her. She pulled out her well-worn paperback novel and tried to lose herself in someone else's story, anything to quiet the memories that seemed particularly loud this morning. As she reached for her coffee cup, Sarah noticed her hands trembling slightly. It was something that happened more frequently lately, especially on days when the dreams were particularly vivid. The doctors had assured her it was normal, a common response to the stress her body had endured during her military career. 22 years of high-stress situations, split-second decisions, and the constant weight of responsibility had left their mark. She had been a communications specialist in the Air Force, responsible for maintaining radio contact between ground control and aircraft during critical missions. Her call sign, Eagle 7, had been her identity for more than 2 decades. In the military, your call sign was more than just a designation. It was who you were, your reputation, your legacy. Sarah had earned hers during a particularly challenging mission in Afghanistan, when her calm voice and quick thinking had guided a damaged aircraft safely back to base despite communication failures and enemy fire. The transition to civilian life had been harder than she had anticipated. People always thanked her for her service, but they never quite understood what that service had cost. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive in war zones now made grocery shopping an ordeal. The skills that had made her invaluable in crisis situations seemed useless in a world concerned with quarterly reports and office politics. Sarah had tried various jobs since retiring. She worked briefly at a telecommunications company, thinking her communication skills would translate well to the corporate world. But the endless meetings about nothing, the office politics, and the general lack of urgency had left her feeling empty and disconnected. She quit after 6 months and had been living off her military pension since then, trying to figure out what came next. The cafe door chimed as another early customer entered. Sarah glanced up briefly before returning to her book. It was a man in his 50s, wearing a pilot's uniform from one of the major airlines. Something about his bearing, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence and alert awareness, immediately identified him as military. There was a certain posture, a way of scanning a room upon entering, that never quite left those who had served. The pilot ordered his coffee and selected a table across the cafe from Sarah. She noticed him checking his watch and phone repeatedly. The nervous energy of someone with a tight schedule. Sarah remembered that feeling well, the constant awareness of time and schedules that military life demanded. Every mission was planned down to the minute, every movement calculated and coordinated. As Sarah turned the page of her book, she overheard the pilot talking on his phone in hushed tones. She caught fragments of conversation about flight schedules, weather conditions, and crew changes. The familiar terminology brought back a flood of memories from her own days, coordinating communications for flight operations. She tried to focus on her reading, but the sound of aviation jargon was like hearing a song from her youth. The morning light grew stronger, casting longer shadows across the cafe floor. Sarah finished her first cup of coffee and considered ordering another. Mrs. Aran Chen was busy preparing for the morning rush, grinding beans and arranging pastries in the display case. The comfortable routine of the cafe was helping to settle Sarah's nerves, pushing back the anxiety that had followed her from her restless night. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from her sister in California, asking about her plans for Thanksgiving. These family check-ins had become more frequent since her retirement, as if everyone was waiting for her to have some kind of breakdown. Her sister meant well, but the constant questions about her emotional state and future plans only added to Sarah's sense of being adrift. She typed back a brief response, assuring her sister she was fine and would call later. The truth was more complicated. Some days she felt fine, even optimistic about the future. Other days, like today, she felt like she was waiting for something to happen, some sign or signal that would tell her what direction to take next. The pilot across the cafe finished his call and pulled out a tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be flight plans or weather reports. His focused concentration reminded Sarah of her own pre-mission rituals, the careful review of communication protocols and backup procedures that had been second nature for so many years. There was something comforting about watching someone else go through the familiar process of professional preparation. Sarah ordered her second cup of coffee, savoring the warmth as it spread through her chest. The caffeine was beginning to clear the fog of her restless night, sharpening her awareness of her surroundings. She noticed details, the way Mrs. Chen hummed softly while working, the sound of traffic beginning to increase outside, the subtle shift in light as the sun rose higher. These moments of heightened awareness were another remnant of her military training. In combat zones, noticing details could mean the difference between life and death. Every sound, every movement, every change in routine was potentially significant. Sarah had learned to read environments like other people read books, gathering information and assessing threats automatically. As she lifted her coffee cup to her lips, Sarah heard something that made her freeze mid-motion. Through the pilot's open tablet, she could hear the faint sound of radio chatter. It was distant and scratchy, probably from an aviation app or communication system he was monitoring. But embedded in that static and noise was something that made her heart stop. A voice, calm and professional, was calling out a series of codes and designations. Sarah's trained ear automatically began parsing the information, translating the military communication protocols that had once been as familiar as her own name, and then, cutting through the static like a knife, she heard it clearly. Eagle 7, this is ground control. Eagle 7, please respond. The coffee cup slipped from Sarah's suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering against the saucer. Her call sign, her designation, the identity she had carried for 22 years and had thought was buried with her military career. But there it was, crackling through the radio static in a Portland cafe on a quiet Thursday morning. The pilot looked up from his tablet, concerned by the sound of breaking porcelain. Mrs. Bao Chen hurried over with a towel to clean up the spilled coffee. But Sarah sat frozen, her eyes locked on the pilot's tablet, waiting to hear if the impossible voice would call her name again. Her mind raced through possibilities. It could be a coincidence, someone else with the same call sign. Call signs were sometimes reused or assigned to different personnel, but the voice, the tone, the specific way the words were pronounced, all felt hauntingly familiar. It was like hearing a ghost from her past, reaching across the years to summon her back to a world she thought she had left behind. The radio chatter continued, but the call for Eagle 7 was not repeated. Sarah sat in stunned silence, her heart pounding and her hands shaking more violently than before. Around her, the cafe continued its normal rhythm. Mrs. Chen finished cleaning up the spilled coffee, the pilot returned to his tablet, and the morning customers began arriving in greater numbers. But for Sarah, everything had changed. The peaceful routine of her civilian morning had been shattered by 4 words from her past. Eagle 7, please respond. As if some part of her military life was calling her back, refusing to let her disappear into the anonymous comfort of retirement. She stared at the pilot's tablet, willing the voice to return to explain what was happening. But the radio chatter had moved on to other communications, other call signs, other missions. Whatever had summoned Eagle 7 was lost in the static of ongoing operations. Sarah realized she was holding her breath and forced herself to exhale slowly. She looked around the cafe, wondering if anyone else had noticed the strange moment that had just occurred. But everyone was absorbed in their own morning routines, oblivious to the earthquake that had just shaken Sarah's carefully constructed civilian life. The question that now burned in her mind was simple but terrifying. Why was someone calling for Eagle 7? And what would happen if she answered? Sarah couldn't concentrate on anything for the rest of the day. After leaving the cafe in a daze, she drove home to her small apartment and spent hours pacing the living room, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. The voice calling for Eagle 7 had been clear, professional, and undeniably real. But the rational part of her mind insisted it had to be some kind of mistake or coincidence. By evening, Sarah had convinced herself it was probably nothing more than an aviation communication app playing old recordings or simulations. Pilots often used training software that included recorded radio chatter from various scenarios. It was the most logical explanation, and she clung to it like a lifeline. The next morning, she almost didn't go to the cafe. But routine was one of the few things keeping her anchored, and she needed the familiar comfort of her corner table and black coffee. She arrived at her usual time, relieved to see that the pilot from yesterday was nowhere to be found. Mrs. Chen greeted her with a warm smile and her usual order, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. Sarah settled into her corner table with a different book, determined to have a peaceful morning. She had slept better the night before, finally managing to push the previous day's incident to the back of her mind. The morning sun streamed through the cafe window, and the familiar sounds of espresso machines and quiet conversation created a comforting backdrop. But just as she was beginning to relax, the door chimed, and the same pilot from yesterday walked in. Sarah's stomach clenched as she watched him order his coffee and take the same table across the cafe. He looked tired, she noticed, with dark circles under his eyes and a distracted air that suggested he hadn't slept well either. The pilot pulled out his tablet again, and Sarah found herself watching him with the intensity of a surveillance operative. She told herself she was being ridiculous, but she couldn't help straining to hear any sounds coming from his device. For nearly an hour, there was nothing but the normal noise of the cafe and occasional phone conversations. Then, just as Sarah was beginning to think she had imagined the whole thing, it happened again. The faint crackle of radio static emerged from the pilot's tablet, followed by the familiar cadence of military communications. Sarah's book lay forgotten in her lap as she listened intently to the background chatter. Ground control to all units, we have a priority communication. Stand by for emergency frequencies. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. Priority communications meant something serious was happening, something that required immediate attention from all available personnel. Her pulse quickened as she listened to the formal protocols being followed, protocols she had executed countless times during her military career. And then it came again. Clearer this time. Eagle 7, this is command. Eagle 7, immediate response required. Authentication code Alpha Delta 779. Sarah's blood went cold. The authentication code was specific, current, and matched protocols she recognized. This wasn't a training simulation or old recording. This was an active military communication, and someone was desperately trying to reach Eagle 7. Without thinking, Sarah stood up and walked quickly across the cafe to the pilot's table. He looked up, startled by her sudden approach. Up close, she could see the stress lines around his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. "Excuse me," Sarah said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I couldn't help but notice your radio communications. I'm former Air Force, and I think someone might be trying to reach me." The pilot studied her carefully, his eyes taking in details that most civilians would miss. He saw the way she held herself, the alert posture, the direct eye contact. After a moment, he nodded slowly. "Colonel Michael Hayes, retired," he said, extending his hand. "And you are?" "Sarah Martinez, former communications specialist, call sign Eagle 7. The recognition in his eyes was immediate. "Jesus," he whispered. "You're the one they've been trying to reach." Colonel Hayes quickly adjusted settings on his tablet, increasing the volume and switching to a clearer frequency. The radio chatter became more distinct, and Sarah could hear the urgency in the voices coming through the speakers. "Eagle 7, this is Colonel Patricia Williams, Pentagon Communications. We have a code red situation requiring your immediate expertise. Please respond on Secure Channel 7. Sarah sank into the chair across from Hayes, her mind reeling. Colonel Patricia Williams had been her superior officer during her last assignment, a brilliant strategist who now held a high-level position at the Pentagon. If Patricia was personally trying to reach her, the situation was serious beyond imagination. "Why are they contacting you through civilian channels?" Sarah asked Hayes. "I'm part of the Reserve Communication Network," he explained quietly. "We maintain contact with retired personnel who might be needed for emergency situations. Your file came through yesterday marked Priority Alpha. That's the highest classification level." Priority Alpha meant national security was at stake. Sarah had only seen that designation used 3 times during her entire career, and each instance had involved threats to American lives or critical infrastructure. Her mouth went dry as the implications sank in. "Eagle 7, please acknowledge. We know you're receiving this transmission. Lives depend on your response." The desperation in Colonel Williams's voice cut through Sarah's shock. Whatever was happening, people were in danger, and her specific skills were needed. But she had been retired for 3 years. Her security clearances had expired, her access to military systems had been revoked, and she was officially just another civilian living in Portland. "I don't understand," Sarah said to Hayes. "My clearances are dead. I'm not even in the system anymore." Hayes pulled up a secure message on his tablet and showed it to Sarah. The document bore official Pentagon letterhead and was classified at the highest levels. As Sarah read, her confusion deepened into alarm. The message outlined a critical situation involving a compromised satellite communication network that controlled early warning systems for several allied nations. Cyber attackers had infiltrated the system and were systematically disabling communication links that protected against missile threats. Standard countermeasures had failed, and the attackers seemed to anticipate every move the Pentagon made. But buried in the technical details was something that made Sarah's blood run cold. The attackers were using modified versions of communication protocols that she had helped develop during a classified project 5 years earlier. Protocols that were so specialized and secure that only a handful of people in the world understood how they worked. "They need someone who understands the original architecture," Hayes explained. "Someone who can trace the modifications and find a way to regain control. According to this, you're one of only 3 people alive who worked on the original project." "What happened to the other 2? Hayes's expression grew grim. Dr. Robert Chen died in a car accident last week. Major Lisa Thompson was found dead in her apartment 3 days ago. Both deaths are being investigated as potential homicides. The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. Someone was systematically eliminating the people who could stop this attack, and now they were coming for her. Eagle 7, this is your final call. If you don't respond within the next 10 minutes, we'll have to assume you're compromised or deceased. Emergency protocols will be activated. Emergency protocols meant the military would send teams to physically locate her, whether she wanted to be found or not. Sarah looked around the cafe, suddenly seeing it with new eyes. The peaceful morning crowd, Mrs. Chen humming behind the counter, the normal rhythm of civilian life, all of it could be shattered if she was pulled back into the world she had tried to leave behind. But people were dying. The 2 other experts who could have solved this problem were already dead, probably murdered to prevent them from helping, and somewhere in the world, satellite systems that protected millions of people were being systematically disabled by attackers who seemed to know exactly what they were doing. Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them, Colonel Hayes was watching her intently, waiting for her decision. "I need to use your communication system," she said finally. Hayes nodded and handed her a secure headset. Sarah adjusted the frequency to the channel Colonel Williams had specified and cleared her throat. When she spoke, her voice carried the calm authority that had defined Eagle 7 for 22 years. "Command, this is Eagle 7. Authentication code Alpha Delta 779 confirmed. I'm here and I'm listening." The response was immediate and filled with relief. "Eagle 7, thank God. We've been trying to reach you for 36 hours. We have a situation that requires your immediate attention. Can you get to a secure location?" Sarah looked around the cafe one more time, knowing that her quiet civilian life was about to end. Mrs. Chen was still humming, completely unaware that her regular customer was being recruited for a mission that could determine the fate of nations. "Negative, Command. I'm in a civilian location. What's the immediate threat assessment?" Eagle 7. We've lost communication with early warning systems protecting the eastern seaboard. If we can't regain control within the next 12 hours, we'll be flying blind to any incoming threats. We need you to analyze the compromised protocols and find a way back into the system. 12 hours. Sarah's mind automatically began calculating what could be accomplished in that time frame, what resources would be needed, what risks they would face. The analytical skills that had made her invaluable in crisis situations were already engaging, pushing aside the fear and uncertainty. "Understood, Command. I'll need access to the original project files and a secure terminal, and I'll need protection. If this is connected to the deaths of Chen and Thompson, I'm a target." "Affirmative, Eagle 7. We're dispatching a security team to your location. They'll escort you to a secure facility where you can begin work immediately." As Sarah handed the headset back to Hayes, she realized that every person in the cafe had gone silent. Mrs. Chen was standing behind the counter, her mouth open in shock. The morning customers were all staring at their table, having heard enough of the conversation to understand that something serious was happening. The room had indeed gone dead silent, just as Sarah's peaceful retirement had ended with a voice from her past, calling her back to duty. In 12 hours, she would either save the early warning systems that protected millions of lives, or the attackers would succeed in blinding America's defenses. Eagle 7 was back in service, whether she was ready or not. The security team arrived at the cafe within 20 minutes, their black SUVs pulling up outside with the efficiency Sarah remembered from her military days. 2 agents in civilian clothes entered the cafe, their eyes quickly scanning the room and assessing potential threats. Sarah recognized the type immediately. Former Special Forces, probably CIA or NSA, trained to move quickly and quietly. Mrs. Chen looked terrified as the agents approached Sarah's table. The regular customers had mostly left, sensing that something dangerous was unfolding in their peaceful morning sanctuary. Sarah felt a pang of guilt for bringing this world into the cafe that had become her refuge. "Ms. Martinez, I'm Agent Rodriguez," the lead agent said quietly. "We need to move immediately. Intelligence suggests the attackers are aware of our attempt to contact you." Sarah stood without argument but paused to speak to Mrs. Chen. "I'm sorry about this," she said softly. "Your cafe has been a sanctuary for me. I hope it can be again someday." The older woman nodded, still too shocked to speak. Colonel Hayes gathered his equipment and fell into step behind them, apparently assigned to the mission as well. The drive to the secure facility took them through downtown Portland and then into the hills overlooking the city. Sarah watched her civilian life disappear through the rear window, wondering if she would ever return to her quiet apartment and morning routine. The agents maintained radio contact with multiple command centers, and from their terse communications, Sarah gathered that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. "We've lost contact with 3 more satellite arrays in the past hour," Rodriguez reported as they drove. "The attackers are accelerating their timeline." The secure facility turned out to be a nondescript office building that housed a regional NSA operations center. Underground, however, it contained some of the most sophisticated communication and computer systems Sarah had ever seen. The main operations room buzzed with activity as dozens of analysts worked frantically at their stations. Colonel Williams was waiting for them, looking haggard but determined. Sarah hadn't seen her former commander in 3 years, and the stress of the current crisis had clearly taken its toll. They greeted each other with the professional courtesy of soldiers who had served together in high-pressure situations. "Eagle 7, I'm going to be direct," Williams said without preamble. "We're facing the most sophisticated cyber attack in American history. The attackers have somehow obtained your classified communication protocols and modified them to create backdoors into our most sensitive systems." Sarah was led to a secure terminal where the technical details of the attack were displayed on multiple monitors. As she studied the data, her worst fears were confirmed. The attackers hadn't just stolen her protocols, they had improved them, creating communication pathways that were virtually undetectable using conventional security measures. "This is brilliant work," Sarah admitted reluctantly. "Whoever did this understands the original architecture better than most of the people who built it." "That's what worries us," Williams replied. "We think we're dealing with either a former insider or someone who had access to classified materials that should have been destroyed." Sarah spent the next hour analyzing the attack patterns, tracing the modifications back to their source code. The work was mentally exhausting, requiring her to recall details from projects she had completed years earlier. But gradually, a picture began to emerge that chilled her to the bone. "Patricia," Sarah said finally, looking up from her analysis, "I don't think this is a foreign attack. The modifications to my protocols show an understanding of American military doctrine that goes beyond what any external attacker could achieve." "You're saying this is domestic?" "I'm saying whoever is doing this learned these systems from the inside. They know not just how the protocols work, but why we built them the way we did. That level of understanding suggests—" Sarah's words trailed off as a horrible possibility occurred to her. She turned back to the terminal and began pulling up personnel files from the original project team. Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she cross-referenced security clearances, project assignments, and current locations. "My God," she whispered. "What is it?" "Major David Hartley. He was the project's security officer, the one person who had access to everyone's work. He disappeared 6 months ago, supposedly killed in a hiking accident, but his body was never found." Sarah pulled up Hartley's service record on the screen. He had been a brilliant officer with an exemplary career until a psychological evaluation had raised concerns about his mental stability. The evaluation had been classified, but Sarah remembered the rumors about Hartley's increasing paranoia and his belief that the military was becoming too dependent on technology. He always argued that our communication systems were too vulnerable, Sarah continued. He said that anyone who understood them well enough could use them against us. We thought he was just being cautious, but maybe he was planning something. Colonel Williams immediately ordered a full investigation into Hartley's disappearance and any connections he might have to the current attack. But time was running short, and regardless of who was behind it, they still needed to stop the assault on the satellite systems. Sarah dove back into the technical analysis, this time looking for Hartley's specific signature in the code modifications. If he was behind this, he would have left traces of his approach, methodologies that Sarah could recognize and potentially exploit. As she worked, reports continued to arrive from around the country. The attackers had now compromised early warning systems protecting major population centers. Military bases were going to backup protocols, and NORAD was operating at the highest alert level short of actual war. "We have maybe 4 hours before they achieve complete system penetration," an analyst reported. "After that, we'll have no automated defense against incoming threats." Sarah's mind raced as she studied Hartley's modifications. He had been thorough, but like many brilliant people, he had been unable to resist adding personal flourishes to his work. Small coding preferences and structural approaches that were as distinctive as a fingerprint. "I found something," Sarah announced, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. Hartley embedded a series of authentication checkpoints in his modifications. They're designed to verify his identity before executing major system changes. "Can you use that against him?" "Maybe. If I can reverse engineer his authentication protocol, I might be able to convince the system that I'm him. Once I'm inside, I can start undoing the damage." The next 2 hours were the most intense of Sarah's career. Working with a team of the military's best cyber warfare specialists, she slowly unraveled Hartley's authentication system. It was a complex puzzle that required not just technical knowledge, but psychological insight into how Hartley's mind worked. Colonel Hayes proved invaluable, using his pilot's understanding of systems integration to help Sarah navigate the interconnected satellite networks. Williams coordinated with Pentagon Command, providing real-time intelligence about new attacks and system vulnerabilities. With 1 hour remaining before total system compromise, Sarah finally cracked Hartley's authentication protocol. Her hands shook as she prepared to enter the compromised network, knowing that one mistake could trigger additional security measures that would lock them out permanently. "This is it," Sarah announced to the room. "I'm going in." She initiated the authentication sequence, her modified credentials passing through layers of security that Hartley had established. For several tense moments, the system seemed to hesitate, analyzing her identity and verifying her authorization. Then, suddenly, she was inside. The view from within the compromised system was breathtaking and terrifying. Hartley had created a virtual command center that gave him control over satellite networks spanning the globe. Sarah could see real-time feeds from early warning systems, communication arrays, and defense networks that she hadn't known existed. But she could also see the systematic destruction that Hartley had planned. Automated routines were methodically disabling system after system, creating gaps in America's technological defenses that would take months to repair. If she hadn't stopped him, the country would have been virtually blind to external threats. Working as quickly as she dared, Sarah began reversing Hartley's modifications. Each change required careful consideration, as hasty corrections could damage the systems permanently. She felt like a surgeon performing delicate operations on a patient's nervous system, knowing that one wrong cut could cause irreparable harm. "Sarah," Williams called urgently, "we're getting reports that someone is trying to trigger the final phase of the attack manually. Hartley must realize we've penetrated his system. How long do I have?" "Maybe 20 minutes. Sarah's fingers flew over the keyboard as she raced to undo months of careful sabotage. One by one, the satellite systems came back online, their communication links restored and their defensive protocols reactivated. But with each system she recovered, the manual override attempts became more aggressive. With 5 minutes to spare, Sarah completed the restoration of the final critical system. The early warning networks were fully operational again, and the backdoors that Hartley had created were sealed. But as she began to log out of the system, an alert appeared on her screen. Warning, manual system purge initiated. All data will be destroyed in 60 seconds. Hartley was trying to destroy the entire network, rather than let it fall back into military hands. Sarah had 1 minute to implement a final safeguard that would protect the systems from future attacks. Drawing on every technique she had learned in 22 years of military service, Sarah created a new security protocol in the final seconds before Hartley's purge activated. It was crude and temporary, but it would hold long enough for military engineers to implement permanent protections. The purge command executed, but instead of destroying the systems, it found only empty shells. Sarah had moved all critical functions to protected partitions that Hartley couldn't reach. His final act of sabotage had failed. The operations room erupted in cheers as confirmation arrived that all satellite systems were secure and operational. Sarah leaned back in her chair, emotionally and physically drained. She had been back in service for less than 8 hours, but it felt like a lifetime. "Outstanding work, Eagle 7, Williams said, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You've probably saved countless lives today." As the immediate crisis passed, Sarah found herself thinking about the cafe where this had all started. Mrs. Chen would be closing for the evening soon, probably still wondering what had happened to her quiet regular customer. The corner table by the window would be empty, waiting for someone who might never return to claim it. But Sarah realized something had changed in her during the past 8 hours. The skills that had felt useless in civilian life had proved invaluable when lives were at stake. The hypervigilance that made grocery shopping difficult had been exactly what was needed to spot the subtle clues in Hartley's code. "Patricia," Sarah said finally, "I think I'd like to discuss coming back to active duty." Williams smiled for the first time since the crisis began. "I was hoping you'd say that. We could use someone with your expertise on a permanent basis." Sarah thought about her quiet apartment, her peaceful morning routine, and the civilian life she had tried to build. It had been a good life, but it had never felt complete. Something had always been missing, some sense of purpose that her military service had provided. The voice calling for Eagle 7 through the radio static had been more than just a request for help. It had been a summons back to the life she was meant to live, the identity that civilian clothes and morning coffee couldn't erase. 3 weeks later, Sarah returned to the cafe one final time. Mrs. Chen greeted her warmly, and they talked about the morning when strange men in suits had disrupted the peaceful routine. Sarah explained as much as she could about what had happened, though most of the details remained classified. "Will you be coming back?" Mrs. Chen asked, as Sarah prepared to leave. Sarah looked around the cafe one last time, memorizing the corner table where her civilian life had ended and her true calling had begun again. "I don't think so," she said softly. "But thank you for giving me a place to land when I needed it." As Sarah walked out of the cafe and toward the car that would take her back to military service, she realized she was no longer afraid of the dreams that had haunted her retirement. Eagle 7 wasn't a ghost from her past. It was who she had always been and who she was meant to be. The voice calling her name through the radio static had brought her home.